esteemed delegates and participants, it is a glorious moment for me as the chairman of Repression to extend my warm greeting on behalf of Repression. I take this proud moment to share a few words about the work of Repression. Repression is not a normal child who had an easy birth. This pandemic has affected the whole world and has turned the world upside. So did it have its impact on our lives too. There were so many who lost their lives, and some were dead, though alive, or they lost their jobs. But strong men survived all odds. So did we, our team Repression. Our team has three co-founders strongly backing up each other with innovative ideas and untiring work. I am proud of the team, Mr. Karthikeyan, the secretary, Mr. Sri Shakti, the director, and myself. Repression is nothing but the finding of the pandemic, a blessing it came. Initially, in September, we began a YouTube channel, Repression Podcast. With your overwhelming support and belief in us, we have 2,500 subscribers today. A special thanks to our viewers. We have 3 spectacular monthly segments. Expert Library, hosted by our director, Mr. Sri Shakti, wherein professors from international universities give lectures on their areas of expertise. Next is the Essential Reads, that deals with interviews with prominent writers hosted by me. And the Writers Preview is a wonderful platform for the writers to showcase their recent publication. It is hosted by our secretary, Mr. Karthikeyan. Apart from the YouTube channel, we successfully launched our website, Repression, as an online course provider a month ago. Though this concept is a bit new and clueless for our audience, we are sure that you'll come to know more about the benefits of Repression as time passes by. We have 2 highly resourceful courses right now, which forms the hardcore for cracking NET exam, and there are many more to follow. Now, we have around 2,900 subscribers for our website. We look forward to reach 10,000 very soon. The specialty of the website is that a person who visits it will definitely be benefited out of it. We have 10 prep tests uploaded already, which are totally free of cost. Every fortnight, the website will be uploaded with a new prep test. These prep tests are highly beneficial for UGC NET aspirants and other government exams related to English literature. Moreover, we conduct a mock test during the first week of every month to make it possible for the NET aspirants to get an idea as to how to make it possible for the NET. To get an idea as to how their preparatory level is exactly. In short, for anything related to English literature, Repression is the ideal place.
What is Repression? Repression is the only online course provider in the world exclusive to the study of English literature. Be a part of the new standard.
Repression provides courses that are designed with the top-of-the-notch learning management system. This is something used by other famous course providers like Udemy and Coursera. We have incorporated an easy-to-use learning environment that makes use of video lectures, downloadable resources and tests. Creating a Repression account will enable you to have a more personalized learning experience. Welcome to the new standard. Can learning be fun? Think again. Come to Repression and we will tell you how. Gamified way of learning is a must-have for every learning management system. Guess what? Repression has a unique credit and award system which will make learning nothing less than fun. Say hello to the new standard.
Having told all about Repression, it is time for us to know why we are here. Repression is proud to organize its first international webinar in association with the 457th birthday of the literary legend, William Shakespeare. On this occasion, I welcome the speakers, Mr. Karthikeyan, the Secretary of Reprieve, Professor John Prakatis from University of Stirling, United Kingdom, and our knowledgeable YouTube audience. No doubt, it is going to be a brainstorming and stimulating session for the topic of the webinar is called The Science of Mental Life, Understanding Shakespeare through Psychoanalysis. So, here we go into the first session of the webinar. The speaker is Mr. Karthikeyan. He's completed his MA MPhil in English Literature. His area of interest are psychoanalytic literary criticism, critical studies, and British fiction. He has presented and published many papers. He is with us today to give a lecture on the topic, Unchained Maladies, Character Studies of Iago and Otholo. It's going to be a marvelous session, no doubt about it. Over to Mr. Karthik.
Thank you, Dr. Sashikala. Good evening, everybody who have come here to witness this grand occasion. I'm here to talk about my arguments regarding the characters of Iago and Otholo. So the topic, the title for my topic and for my arguments is Unchained Maladies, a character study of Iago and Otholo. I gave the title Unchained Maladies because when a malady is chained, it is particularly evident because of repression. So as a result of repression, it stays inside the unconscious of the mind of characters in literary analysis. But here it becomes unchained as two people who have so much in common, as well as there are many differences between the two of them. So when you get into the nitty-gritty of these characters and make a study of them, you will find many interesting things, and I am going to share two of the interesting things about each of these characters. So the first point I'm going to discuss is Iago's psychological powers. So there has been a long tradition among Shakespeare scholars in attributing psychological powers to Iago. This psychological power is something that is not new to us. It has already been discussed. So what psychological power is that? I'll tell you about it. Popular Shakespearean critic A.C. Bradley says that Iago's most remarkable gift is his insight into human nature. This particular point is something that you have to note down, because when I make my argument, that particular phrasing, insight into human nature, will come into play. Cognitive theorists refer to Iago's talent as mind reading. Iago's talent in the play is making other people's lives miserable. So this talent of Iago is actually considered as mind reading by many of the contemporary cognitive theorists in the field of cognitive psychology. So his ability to access imaginatively another person's mental world is attributed to Iago. In Iago's case, he manipulates that world cruelly. Cruelty is his weapon of choice. Inversely proportional to Iago's mind-reading ability is the mind-blindedness, metacognitive deficits of Otholo. In here, Otholo has mind-blindedness as well as metacognitive deficits, but Iago has the one thing that Otholo does not possess, and that is the ability to mind read people. So Otholo is too obtuse and closed off from others to even understand Iago's unimaginable designs, all because of his mind blindness and metacognitive deficits pertaining Otholo. Cognitive theorists and evolutionary psychologists say that mind reading confers natural fitness. If a person can mind read, that usually means that the person is naturally fit in terms of the mind-body imperative. So mind readers, what they actually do is they bring out the intentions of others, manipulate or change truth-telling, they track or follow the past actions, and they accurately predict the future behavior of those around them, of those people who are mind read by these mind readers. So my question to you is, what if thinking too much about what others are thinking strikes at the mind reader's sense of contentment? The sense of contentment that a mind reader has is struck because of thinking too much about what other people are thinking. So the very act of mind reading deprecates the sense of contentment that a mind reader has. So here the mind reader is Iago. So this sense of contentment is an elusive quality ascribed to Otholo and not Iago in the play. So Otholo's contentment, even though is attributed to him, it lasts only until Iago's fabrications take hold and puts a stop to it. So the next point is mind reading as a psychological handicap. When we talked about contentment, we didn't say that it was an everlasting aspect. So we can say that contentment is a perishable commodity that confers on us peace of mind only to the degree that we are not bothered too much to mind the business of others. So it is similar to a private and uninterrupted mode of attention that contemporary psychologists usually call psychic flow. So psychic flow is an uninterrupted mode of attention, usually coined by contemporary psychologists. What if Iago's mind reading is a psychological handicap? Even though mind reading may seem as something positive, I argue that Iago's mind reading is the very thing that handicaps him from attaining fulfillment in terms of the self-consciousness. So such an approach to understanding Iago's character involves rethinking the causal nexus. Nexus is nothing but the bonding or link between a cause and its effect. Here, the cause is mind reading and the effect is cruelty. So what is the bond or linking between these two aspects? We will get into it more in further points. So what I'm trying to say is we have to rethink the causal nexus between three things: cruelty, motive, and character in the play. So Iago's evil doing does not follow from his mind reading, but gradually displaces it, which in turn provides him with the contentedness of which he is constitutionally deprived of, I say. So the ontological gain of Iago's negation of his hyper-attunement to others is the very construction of his own self-narrative. So that there appears a shift of attention from other to self. This involves some prominent sadomasochism along the way. Sadomasochism is the derivation of gratification from the infliction of physical pain or humiliation either on another person or on oneself. You know that there is a word called sadist and a masochist. Here we combine them and come up with this kind of meaning where the humiliation is either placed on another person or on oneself. Cognitively overloaded, Iago is also the victim as well as the exploiter of the imagined intentions and beliefs of those around him. Let me clarify what I'm saying here. So he is considered a victim as well as an exploiter because he is overloaded in terms of his cognitive capabilities. As a result, his mind reading is not a manipulable talent, but it can also be taken as the unavoidable cause of his motiveless evil. His evil is not motivated by any factors, so we call it as motiveless evil. So on the outset, Iago does seem to be a talented and complacent mind reader. The success of his project rests on his belief in Otholo's, quote, free and open nature that thinks men honest, that but seem to be so, unquote. So the next point I'm trying to say is Iago has a caricatured version of Otholo. He intuits Rodrigo's gullibility and easily convinces the said person, Rodrigo, of Desdemona's fickleness. Fickleness is changeability, especially in terms of one's loyalties or affections. So Iago capitalizes on Desdemona's purity. Quote, for 'tis most easy, the inclining Desdemona to subdue in any honest suit. Unquote. The reach of Iago's evil is partly contingent on the predictive accuracy of his estimation of the characters around him. Examples can be seen when we see the dull honesty of Otholo, the pliancy of Desdemona, and Cassio's rash nature. Iago knows that Cassio's rash nature will respond violently to Rodrigo's incitements. Iago tells Cassio that Desdemona is so free of disposition and then underscores the point in his monologue, describing her as, quote, framed as fruitful as the free elements and inclining toward any honest suit. Cassio thinks it freely when he refers to Iago's insistence that Desdemona loves him. Iago describes his own advice as free and open, as if parodying everyone's erroneous opinion of his own honesty, as well as his very overuse of these terms. So the truest irony is that we are able to embrace Iago's caricatured version of Otholo only when we see Otholo as someone who is hopeless and innocent. Otholo is not easily duped since he demands truthful evidence of Desdemona's infidelity when it becomes questioned in front of him. The next point is Otholo's enviable sense of contentment. In his conversation or response against critics like A.C. Bradley, F.R. Lewis focuses on Otholo's noble egotism and heroic self-dramatization, which is represented by Otholo's pompous diction. For example, his belief that, quote, big wars make ambition virtue, and his sense of Desdemona as a trophy wife. He considers Desdemona as someone whom he can show off in front of his contemporaries in the Venetian society. So his love of her is directly emanating from self-centeredness and is mixed with pride, sensual possessiveness, and what he himself calls love of loving. Lewis concludes that a habit of self-approving self-dramatization is an essential element of Otholo's makeup and remains so at the very end. When we consider that statement of Lewis, we can clearly see that Iago's dilemma straightly lies between theory and practice. He has the unrelenting inclination for mind reading, but he cannot accurately do so in practice. Improvisation is certainly one of his best talents, but his very need for that mind reading deprives him and makes him unable to predictively gauge how his projects will unfold. So Iago's challenge is the inescapable generic problem of other minds, a challenge that in the world of the play transmutes into a curse. Iago's outsider status derives from thinking too much about what others are thinking and from never being in the moment. For this, the play has its own notion, and that we are going to call that as Iago's malady. And that notion found in the play is discontentment. When Iago stirs up Otholo's jealousy, he strikes at Otholo's enviable sense of contentment. Why? Because Otholo's most valued and self-proclaimed quality is implicitly described in the play as self-satisfaction, ease, invulnerability, and self-fulfillment. When we look at Otholo's statements regarding his own life, we will come to know more about his perception of his own life. Quote, farewell the tranquil mind, farewell content, farewell the plumed troops and the big wars that makes ambition virtue, oh farewell, unquote. So this is when Otholo realizes that his world has been withdrawn from him. A famous critic, Stanley Cavell, describes Antony in Antony and Cleopatra. And when he talks about Antony, he says that Antony's loss of contentment follows when his occupation as a self-possessed soldier completely loses meaning. This helps us it helps us to uncover one of Iago's principal motives, which is usually overlooked by critics. The principal motive is that his constitutional discontentedness has even settled on his stratagems before his mind reading takes its place. So most of the critics frequently compared this fractured or compromised ontology of Iago directly to Otholo's fullness of being. Otholo has been described as self-divided, empty, a forlorn nobody. While Otholo seems, at least in the early scenes, to be unified, solid, a veritable somebody. At this point in time, let me give you an interesting quiz. When I told you the words nobody and somebody, here nobody directly in relationship with Iago and somebody with direct relationship to Otholo. Can anyone in the chat come up with the right answer, which I will be telling you in the later part of my session? Can you guess these two lines coming in one of the poems written by a famous American poetess? She is well versed in writing short and meaningful poems. and she uses these two particular words, nobody and somebody, and one of these two words is actually the title of her poem. So I'll keep you guessing, and I'll give you the answer very soon. Now let us move on to the next topic for discussion. Another critic, Janet Adelman, remarks that Otholo, in particularly in relation to Desdemona, becomes Iago's primary target only because Otholo has the presence, the fullness of being which Iago lacks. Otholo is everywhere associated with the kind of interior solidity and wholeness that stands as a reproach to Iago's interior emptiness and fragmentation. So this emptiness and fragmentation makes him a nobody, while on the other hand, Otholo's fullness of being and the presence makes Otholo a somebody. So such a critical view approaches an important ontological divide between the two characters, Otholo and Iago. So just what does it mean to claim that one person is empty and another person is full? And how do these terms converge with discontentment? For example, fullness aligns more closely in the play with honesty and naivete. This is fully exhibited by Otholo. And it is also exhibited by Rodrigo when he denies the charges of fickleness and libidinousness that Iago levels at Desdemona. Theory of mind is the popular term from the field of psychology as an assessment of an individual's degree of capacity for empathy and understanding of others. This theory of mind is actually shortly abbreviated as TOM. So theory of mind as a personal capability is the very understanding that others have beliefs, desires, intentions, and perspectives that are different from one's own. Possessing a functional theory of mind. As we discussed earlier, the theory of mind is a theory derived from cognitive psychology. We will look at what this theory of mind is related and how it affects Iago. Possessing a functional theory of mind is considered crucial for success in everyday human social interactions, and it is used when we analyze, judge, and infer others' behaviors. The theory of mind impairment describes a difficulty someone would have with perspective taking. This is also sometimes referred to as mind blindness. So the inability to take the perspective of others is actually called mind blindness. This means that individuals with a theory of mind impairment would have a difficult time seeing phenomena from any other perspective than their own. So contentment, as defined in the play, has much to do with the cognitive aspects of the mind reading, mind blindness continuum. To be absolutely content is to be entirely secure and invulnerable. These qualities are inversely proportional to jealousy, the qualities such as being absolutely content, secure, and invulnerable. When we look at Iago's comments here, I quote, "Poor and content is rich and rich enough, but rich as fineless is as poor as winter. To him that ever fears, he shall be poor. Good God, the souls of all my tribe different from jealousy." So to be rendered jealous, but uncertainly so, to be overcome with surmises about the genuine feelings and motives of others, not only toward oneself, but toward a third party. So these are the preoccupations that force one to unravel and predict another's intentions and actions. So regarding mind reading, Jesse Bering, another critic, concludes that people cannot turn off their mind reading skills even if they want to, because all human interactions are forever perceived to be the products of unobservable mental states. So every behavior is subject to intense socio-cognitive scrutiny. So at what point, though, does obsessive behavioral and intentional scrutiny become a psychological handicap? We have been coming to this word psychological handicap repeatedly. The answer will be known at the end of this argument that we are having. The threshold in the play that separates discontentment from mind reading is as thin as the fabric of a handkerchief or the veil of a foredoomed Desdemona. The next topic we are going to talk about is, what is the source of Iago's discontentment? Where does it come from? When you recall Otholo's exclamation upon seeing Desdemona once he returns from war, I quote, It gives me wonder great as my content to see you here before me. My soul hath her content so absolute that not another comfort like this succeeds in unknown fate. Unquote. Contentedness is the calmness that follows the duplicitous stratagems and competitiveness of war. Contentedness is attunement to the unspoken rhythms Otholo is now enjoying with Desdemona, as we saw in his own words. The source of Iago's discontentment is the motive for his evil. So just what is that source? Much of Iago's problems stem from envy, even paranoia directed at Otholo, Cassio, and Desdemona. When we ascribe the discontentment to envy or paranoia, we make the mistake of calling the symptom for a cause. So what leads to such uneasiness and thereafter to envy is his consuming tracking of others. Iago is consumed by his tracking of other people in the play. Consider Iago's comments to Rodrigo about Cassio. I quote, "A knave very voluble, no further conscionable than in putting on the mere form of civil and humane seeming for the better compass of your salt and most hidden loose affection. Why none? Why none? A slipper and subtle knave, a finder of occasion that has an eye can stamp and counterfeit advantages." I unquote. The occasion for this invective is to prompt Rodrigo's insolence against Cassio. But this is also a continuation of Iago's opening monologue in which he talks about the undeserved promotion of Cassio. In Iago's mind, Cassio is a scheming opportunist whose every action is belied to us through a hidden intention, which is to be ferreted out by someone like Iago. The traits of a strong reciprocator. Iago's problems is not even paranoia, since these are perceived qualities in Cassio that, if realized, would affect Otholo and not Iago himself. When we draw on theories of altruism and the evolution of cooperation, William Flesch says that readers read narrative fiction because the heroes are typically strong reciprocators. So reciprocators are those who respond to a gesture or action by making a corresponding one. So these reciprocators are very good at tracking villains. They punish the wrongdoers at significant cost to themselves. What I am trying to say is Iago is also a strong reciprocator because he has all of the traits of a reciprocator, except that what Iago does is he uses these traits for non-cooperative pursuits, personal gains, and he is not, which is not readily apparent in the beginning when you read it on the outset of the play. So considering Iago's contemplation on the doubleness and the secret aspirations of Otholo and Desdemona, we come to this point in the play where he says, "It cannot be long that Desdemona should continue her love to the Moor. Put money in thy purse, nor he his to her. These Moors are changeable in their wills. She must change for youth. When she is sated with his body, she will find the errors of her choice." Unquote. In this quotation, Iago is talking about the complex relationship between Otholo and Desdemona. Even though he thinks that he is able to understand their complex relationship, the very fact is that he is entirely wrong about their dynamic as a couple. How we will see now. Not only is there no evidence on which to base either of these predictions made by Iago, he is also consumed by his predictive accuracy regarding Desdemona's nature in particular, and later elaborates on the theme. After talking about Otholo's limitations, such as his faulty manners and old age, Iago says these words, I quote, "Now for want of these required conveniences, her delicate tenderness will find itself abused, begin to heave the gorge disrelation aboard the Moor. Very nature will instruct her in it and compel her to some second choice." I unquote. When Iago comes up with these plausible theories about the behavior of his peers, these observations are not based on pure knowledge, but purely based on intuition. It also comes from his own past experience and his tracking of past actions of these people. But these theories quickly spin out of control. Even though Iago was right in assuming that Cassio puts his manners to get good effect, he was completely wrong in surmising that Cassio is an immoral time saver. I just received information that many of you answered the question right. Yes, it is a poem written by the Venerable Emily Dickinson. I will talk about the poem in detail in the coming points. Where did I leave off? As a strong reciprocator, Iago uses this particular trait for his own evil gains. Iago was right in assuming that Cassio uses his manners for the good of others, but he was completely wrong in thinking that Cassio is an immoral time server. Iago's TOM prowess. TOM, as I already told you, is theory of mind. I'm going to use the short form here. Iago tries to test, and theoretically, he even congratulates himself on his TOM prowess. It may not be apparently evident, but when you get closer to the text, you will find that he not only uses his TOM prowess on the characters, he congratulates himself when he becomes victorious. And to some extent, he proves himself to be cognitively adept. But we have also seen that his interpretations of others' intentions are disconcerting to us, but it is gratifying to Iago. He creates these circumstances under which he can test his TOM capabilities, but he fails miserably to process the behavioral and intentional results of those tests he conducts on these characters. Let me go back to A.C. Bradley's statements. He shrewdly remarked that Iago could not even stop the plot once it had gotten underway. There is this particular notion regarding Iago and Shakespeare. Many critics who excel in Shakespearean studies have compared Iago to Shakespeare. They say that Iago is nothing but a shadow of Shakespeare. When Shakespeare writes his plays, he is able to control the plot and the outcome of the characters that are in the play. The same role is played by Iago. So Iago is like a shadow character of Shakespeare. So many cognitivist speculations should direct us back to the text in order to test our theory of Iago's theory of his own mind. Even though we are able to see that he is using this prowess, TOM prowess on others, something happens here where an opposite reaction happens. Iago is able to understand his own theory of mind by testing his own prowess on others. This obvious cruelty and his plot not only provides him with a missing self-narrative, but it also has the very contentment that his mind reading places out of his reach. Even though he becomes cruel in order to fill everything about his missing self-narrative, his very contentment, which he gains after his cruelty, places that self-narrative out of his reach. When Iago finds a small measure of satisfaction in his cruelty, that cruelty provides him with a compensatory self-narrative and a belief system that in turn provides him with a theory of his own mind. Cruelty is the means by which he finds value in himself, and cruelty creates a safe distance between Otholo and Iago. Cruelty towards others projects the agent's mind onto the victim as the victim attempts to explain why he is being victimized. Here the agent is Iago and the victim is Otholo. The next point I'm going to delve upon is getting inside the victim's head. As we already saw how Iago plays the role of the agent and Otholo plays the role of the victim, we'll see how Otholo is able to get inside, Iago is able to get inside Otholo's head. The agent can in turn theorize about his own mentalizing by getting inside the victim's head. Cruel agents such as Iago can study their own intentions by reading the narrative effects of their actions on the victim. Consider that there is no direct correlation between Iago's knowledge of others and his knowledge of himself. When Iago doesn't clearly know why he hates Otholo, this proves that he doesn't read himself as well as he does others. All of Iago's motives for hating Otholo have been questioned by the play's best critics. That is why it is worth looking at some of Iago's most revealing comments regarding his hatred of Otholo. I quote, "I hate the Moor, and it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets. I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety." Unquote. in this quotation, Iago leaps from suspiciousness to certain belief, which is considered irrational by many critics. So this is the kind of leap one would make if one didn't trust oneself and didn't quite know one's own motives for hating someone else. So what I'm trying to say is, Otholo doesn't know that he's being hated by Iago. Iago doesn't know that his hatred does not have any valid reason. So a motiveless hatred is what I'm trying to say. After ruminating on his own hatred for Otholo, he does not reflect anymore on why he has such a motive or which motive is the decisive one, because he gives us many reasons. One is his imagined infidelity or the secret affair between Iago's wife and Otholo. He imagines this to be true, but it is not true. This is one reason. The other reason is him not getting promoted. This is also seen as another reason. That's why he says he has done my office. Iago does not reflect, and so we do not know which motive is his decisive motive. Iago's lack of a solid motive to hate Otholo tells us that he remains opaque to himself despite his talent for knowing others. Opaque is something which is difficult to understand. The point before the final point about Iago is cruelty and self-discovery. We have been talking about cruelty for a long time, how he uses cruelty to make Otholo's life miserable. How does this correlate to self-discovery? Let's see. Iago's cruelty affords him self-discoveries along the way. How? We'll see how. One thing Iago does learn is the nature of his own capacity for evil. I quote, "And what's he then that says I play the villain? When this advice is free, I give, and honest, probably to thinking, and indeed the course to win the moor again. For 'tis most easy the inclining Desdemona to subdue in any honest suit, even as her appetite shall play the god with his weak function. How am I then a villain to counsel Cassio to this parallel course, directly to his good divinity of..." We have been talking about the relationship between cruelty and self-discovery and how it relates to the character of Iago in the play Otholo. It seems reductive to claim that Iago simply rationalizes here when he says that he plays the role of a villain just because he has to. The more likely explanation is that he is reviewing his conduct and its effects. He knows that he is evil. He wants to know how evil he can be. He is also taking stock of the inclinations of his several mischievous dupes in order to measure the reach of his evil and derive the source of it. Iago proves to himself not only the fact about his villainy, but also the full extent or measure of his diabolical nature. Cruelty is self-fulfilling because it is both the cause and the result of Iago's action. Iago learns something about his own mind through the process of exploiting other people's minds. When we consider his last monologue, I quote, "I have rubbed this young quart almost to the sense, and he grows angry. Now, whether he kill Cassio or Cassio him, or each do kill the other, every way makes my gain. If Cassio do remain, he hath a daily beauty in his life that makes me ugly." I unquote. This is a simple prediction. This quotation is a simple prediction based on Iago's understanding of Rodrigo's anger. How things will unfold is clear to Rodrigo, but it is very much unclear to Iago. So the final point I'm going to make is the cycle of cruelty. This cycle of cruelty, as suggested by many critics, is nothing but when Iago comes into contact with Otholo and becomes jealous of his promotion and him cuckolding Iago with Iago's wife. he comes to a point where he starts to use his theory of mind prowess on Otholo. And as a result, there begins a cycle of cruelty, where on the one hand, you have Otholo's cruelty getting him more and more information about his own self-narrative, and on the other hand, it takes him out of his own reflection of himself. So this cycle of cruelty is what is going to be my main argument. When it comes to Unchained Malady of Iago, it is purely his discontentment in the play. When we talk about Otholo's malady is a bit complicated because we are going to be dealing with personality types here. And on the one hand, you have extrovert personality type, and on the other hand, you have introvert personality type. What I'm going to argue is that it is because of Otholo's lack of self-knowledge that Otholo is afflicted by this disorder called incoherent view of human nature. When you look at a thorough extrovert, he derives energy from others. The energy one derives is external, but for an introvert, the energy derived is internal. So there is more room for self-introspection in an introvert, and it is much less when it comes to an extrovert. An extrovert lacks this ability to self-introspect, and that is one of the dilemmas troubling Otholo. When we get into the Jungian analysis of character study and look at Otholo from that perspective, through that lens, we will come to realize that he is exhibiting all the characteristics of an extrovert. Otholo is a pure extrovert who is dependent on how other people view about him. When we come to realize how great Otholo is, we do not know of this fact from Otholo himself, but what others are talking about him. So from this very perspective, we are able to surmise that Otholo's inability to analyze himself is the only factor that causes his own destruction in the end of the play. According to Jungian analysis, extroverts are unable to think outside of the zeitgeist. What is this zeitgeist? Every era has its own beliefs and its own ideas. And when we talk about the current society, when we are in a group, there is always this fact called group behavior. So we go along with the group, even though we do not accept or believe in those ideals set by the group. So that's called zeitgeist. When an extrovert is put into that group situation, he is unable to think outside of the zeitgeist. And in this case, Otholo comes into the Venetian society, and in the opening monologue, he talks about his relationship with Desdemona as well as his military prowess. But here, the one thing that dominates his entire opening monologue is his achievements as a soldier and his victories in the war. What takes second place is his complex relationship with Desdemona, because he is the one who thinks that he loves her deeply and not the other way around. The next point I'm trying to make is how is Otholo negating responsibility? At the end of the play, we all know that there is a very disturbing scene where Otholo tries to kill Desdemona. Before killing her, he has this lengthy soliloquy where he thinks about all the circumstances that led to the event. And after murdering her, he negates responsibility for killing her. Only when the entire people in the Venetian society come to know of this heinous act, does he take responsibility for the act. But even then, he thinks that he did this grievous act out of love for her, out of deep love for Desdemona. My argument for Otholo's malady is that he remains an enigma to himself. Why he remains an enigma to himself is because being an extrovert, he doesn't self-introspect. He doesn't analyze himself. He doesn't know what he wants in life. On the other hand, when you look at Iago, he is deprived of any self-knowledge because of his own contentment. Otholo's malady is lack of self-knowledge, and Iago's malady is discontentment. Iago has all the ability to introspect himself, but the one thing that is stopping him from doing so is his cruel acts. We already saw how there is a cycle of cruelty in his psyche. But when it comes to Otholo, because he is an extrovert, he is unable to self-introspect. I've talked about Iago's malady as well as Otholo's malady. When we compare and contrast both these characters, we are able to surmise that Otholo is an extrovert and Iago is an introvert. Both did cruel acts, both had an end that is justifiable according to us. They met an untimely death, but what we can say is that personality differences aside, when you look at nobody and connected with an introvert and somebody and connected with the extrovert, I am reminded of this play by poem by Emily Dickinson, this short but sweet poem. The title of the poem is I Am Nobody, Who Are You? The poem goes like this: I am nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us, don't tell. They would banish us, you know. How dreary to be somebody, how public like a frog, to tell your name the livelong June, to an admiring bog. See here, the admiring bog is nothing but the zeitgeist. And what clearly makes a distinction between Emily Dickinson's view of somebody and Otholo's view of somebody are entirely different. Emily Dickinson is clearly comfortable with the fact that she is a nobody, she is an introvert, and she does not condone extroverts being somebodies and croaking like frogs to admiring bog. The point I am trying to make, which is my concluding remark, is that Otholo's malady is directly in contrast as well as is related to Iago's malady, which is something we don't see in Shakespeare's plays. The antagonist and the protagonist having so much in common as well as varied characteristics about themselves. That's what made me come to this particular area for my character study. Thank you for the opportunity, and despite the technical difficulties, thank you for staying with us. We'll continue with this momentum. Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik. You gave us a different and a deep insight into the characters of Otholo and Iago. There are viewers bubbling with enthusiasm with so many questions to ask. So I think we can straight away go with the questioning session.
Sure, ma'am.
Okay, so we have Mr. Vinod Kumar. His question is, without Iago's character, the play Otholo would not have moved from one act to another. He is a character connected to all in the play. What is your opinion on that?
Mr. Vinod, I was just talking about many critics comparing Iago to Shakespeare himself. Shakespeare plots his dramas, creates these characters and allows them to intermingle and intercommunicate. The same way, Iago plays the role of a playwright, even though he is inside the play itself. That's why I called Iago as the shadow of Shakespeare, and many critics do the same as well. They are also of the same opinion. Vinod, what I would say is that without Iago, there is no play called Otholo. He plays a crucial part as the primary antagonist, and he also leads to Otholo's downfall. So I would say yes, he is very important to the play. Without him, the play loses its meaning as well as focus.
Thank you, Karthik. That was a nice explanation. And now we have another question from Hilal Ashraf. Does the power personal politics that Iago ministers on Otholo by using other characters as pawns point out to the flaw in the play that other characters lack individual consciousness?
That is the very aspect of what we are trying to get into through this character study. When you talk about individual consciousness, the word itself is indicative of the crux of this study, individual consciousness. When you talk about collective consciousness, we are getting to the realm of Carl Jung. He talked about this collective unconscious theory. But individual consciousness is all about
Freud's psychoanalysis. He divided the mind into the unconscious, subconscious, and conscious. But most probably in today's view of psychoanalysis, most have given up the idea of the conscious and the subconscious, and they are still able to believe in the idea of the unconscious. What we have to remind ourselves is that despite disproving most of Freud's theories, who is the father of psychoanalysis, we still follow this line of thought about unconscious, which we got from Sigmund Freud. So even though we might not agree with most of his principles in the realm of psychology, psychology being a pseudoscience which came from philosophy, and this psychology is going to be soon another intrusion into what we call as neuroscience. So most of the people in the neuroscientific realm come to regard psychoanalysis as an important field of inquiry because the quality of unconscious is there. So related to your question, he uses the many characters such as Cassio and Desdemona as his pawns because that is his way of connecting with his self-narrative. He is in need of this playmaking. If he doesn't use these characters and make their lives miserable, he is unable to understand his true self. So he is not doing it out of boredom, he is doing it out of necessity. If he doesn't do this, he doesn't understand himself. So I would agree that individual consciousness comes out of Iago through his cruelty. But I'm not sure about other characters, whether they lack individual consciousness or they have such abundance of individual consciousness. It's up to the reader. So I encourage you to give it a read, the entire play, and come up with your own notion. I believe that those characters do have their individual consciousness, but when we go into their characteristics, I think we will have a long time to discuss about it.
Definitely, Karthik. There's another question from Vinay Vazul. Sir, can you throw light on Iago's hamartia? I mean, psychological point of view.
So, Iago, the one, when we talked about the malady of discontentment, we were also talking about perspective taking. This perspective taking is present in Iago but absent in Otholo because Otholo lacks self-knowledge. On the one hand, Iago is so complete with his self-knowledge that he uses this mind-reading ability to cruelly torture other people. When it comes to psychological point of view, we can say that Iago's psychological points of view are mostly evident in his soliloquies. When you look at his own soliloquies, it is mostly comprised of complaints. He complains about his wife's infidelity to him. He complains about not getting the promotion. He complains about a lot of things wrong with the Venetian society for promoting a more above his status. So he is unable to take responsibility for anything that happens to him, and he blames all the bad things that happen to him on others. So I would say that from his psychological point of view, he has a lot to complain. And if you have anything to more to add about Iago's psychological point of view, please let me know in the chat box. I'll make sure to read it.
Thank you, Karthik. Another question from Sapri Mukherjee. Otholo does not kill Desdemona out of jealousy, but in condition forced upon him by almost superhuman art of Iago. Can you please put insight into the statement?
I read recently about the two perspectives that Shakespearean critics take when talking about Otholo, the supernatural and the natural. When you talk about the natural aspects of the world presented in Otholo, everything that happens around Otholo is of his own making. He becomes promoted in the Venetian army. He gets married to Desdemona. So it is his own decision that leads to his own tragedies. The Shakespearean critics call this aspect of Otholo's life as the natural side of things. The supernatural side of things is when Iago comes into Otholo's life. When we are first introduced to Iago in the play, he, as usual, is complaining about a lot of things, but he himself is readily accepting of Otholo's greatness as a soldier and as also as a human being. So both these sides of Iago is something that is very complex and not easy to understand. Unless we have Iago in person with us and we are able to neuroscientifically divulge into the psyche of this Iago character, maybe I'll be able to come up with a more credible explanation. But regarding the insight you were talking about, my insight is that I agree with the Shakespearean critics. The supernatural element is Iago, and the natural element is Otholo's jealousy. Because the Otholo's jealousy is not something that was brought out by Iago. It was meant to happen because he did not have enough confidence in his marriage as well as Desdemona's love for him. He initially begins to think. I found it in one of his monologues where he's talking about Desdemona's love for him. He says that if Desdemona was able to leave her father for him and ended up marrying him, who would say that he would not do Desdemona would not do the same to Otholo and go after someone else? So when you talk about insecurities, particularly sexual insecurities, this is one of the places where we are completely open to the insecurities displayed by Otholo.
Thank you, Karthik. You have a few general questions too. It's from Mohammed Amal. May I know anything related to the Dark Lady in the life of Shakespeare?
There is this popular consensus that Shakespeare had someone in his life, and he refers to that person, most probably a female, as the Dark Lady in many of his sonnets. I'm not particularly sure about the validity of those kinds of views, but I would say that maybe this Dark Lady was one of the muses of Shakespeare who made him write better sonnets, particularly love sonnets.
That's a highly optimistic answer. And the next question is from Gayatri Rajiv. Does a man Shakespeare really exist according to you, as many critics argue?
If we really put Shakespeare under the lens and see whether there existed a real man really called Shakespeare, we can get into this debate for as long as possible. But since we are short of time, I will give you my one-point remark or one-sentence remark. Shakespeare is as true as his greatness of plays.
Thank you, Karthik. There are still questions popping up, but we have Professor John Rakakis waiting, and it was a wonderful session from your side. I'll be happy if you could leave a few words with the YouTube audience.
To conclude, I had a great time interacting with the audience who came here to see the Literal's rendition of an international webinar. I hope you keep supporting us. We have Professor John Rakakis who is here to take the second session of the day. You are really going to be blown away by his intimate knowledge about Shakespeare. I came to know recently that he is here to debunk psychoanalysis and how it cannot be applied to Shakespeare. I beg to differ, but let's see how Professor Rakakis makes us believe that psychoanalysis is nothing against Shakespeare. Thank you.
Litriol.
Thank you, Karthik.
Hi, Hi, Stephanie Kepke here again. I just wanted to say that I had such an amazing time at my interview yesterday with LitReal for the writer's preview. The questions were incredibly thought-provoking. It was just amazing. We spoke for almost 2 hours, just things that, really sparked such interesting and thoughtful conversation. I loved having a chance to read a selection from my book, which was great, and the questions from the audience was really amazing too. I would highly recommend to any writers who are marketing their book, who have a new book, who have old books, anyone who is looking to be interviewed for anything, for web series, magazine, anything. This is definitely one of the best options that that you can have. It was a great experience.
Hi everybody, I'm Francois Kaiser. I just wanted to share regarding my recent interview with LitReal. I was interviewed by Kartik, and I wanted to say that I think he did a really fantastic job in the interview. He asked me very relevant questions about my book Word Realm, and he also asked me questions about myself as an author and my activities outside of writing, which I think were really great to help readers who are interested in my writing to know a bit more about me. Kartik really put a lot of effort into the questions and in terms of understanding the book that I'd written and why I had written the characters and the story the way that I had. I really recommend that if you get the opportunity to work with LitReal, to be interviewed by Kartik of LitReal, that you jump at it. I really think it's really fantastic for authors to be interviewed by LitReal, and I really think they're doing a great job, Kartik and his team, in terms of supporting authors and helping interview them and spread the word about them as writers and their books. And I wish Kartik and the team all the best of success with LitReal. Well done, and thanks a lot. I was really honored to be on the show. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Katie Bowes, and I'm a New Zealand women's mystery writer. I had the privilege of being interviewed by Dr. Shazi for the Essential Reads broadcast, and it was a great opportunity for me to showcase my novels and to speak about my processes. It's not until we audit what we do and how we do it that we become in a position to leave breadcrumbs for students to follow. I'm also an avid watcher of the LitReal broadcasts. It's a real privilege to be able to listen to hard hitters like Richard Branco talk about their processes and what it was that made them write the kind of poetry that they've produced. Thank you to LitReal and to Dr. Shazi for giving me the opportunity to use my pen and my voice.
So, good evening to each and every one of you who have gathered here today. I humbly apologize for the technical error that occurred, which could have completely ruined the webinar, but hopefully we are back again and we are live. And without anything further to add, I just want to tell you that we have this another amazing session from Professor John Rakakis, who is live with us all the way from the United Kingdom. So, Dr. John Rakakis is a professor of English Studies at the University of Stirling, UK. He is editor of Alternative Shakespeare's Shakespearean Tragedy, the Arden 3 edition of The Merchant of Venice, general editor of Routledge's New Critical Idiom series, and joint editor and contributor to Gothic Shakespeare's. He was also one of the founding members of the Department of Film and Media Studies and was chair of the committee when it became full department of the university in 1985. He has delivered lectures on Renaissance drama in a number of countries across the world and has examined courses and postgraduate dissertations in a number of university English departments. He has also successfully supervised a number of PhD theses in Renaissance literature, modern drama, and critical theory. So without nothing further to add, I think for the most part, many of the texts that you happen to refer to with regard to studying Shakespeare, I think most of these works were pretty much contributed by the man himself. And over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for that introduction. That was very kind of you. Let's keep our fingers crossed and hope we don't suffer another power cut, which was a pity in the middle of that wonderful lecture that we've been listening to. I'm going to get straight into the topic, and I'm going to argue my case through discussion of three plays, Macbeth, Hamlet, and I'll come to Othello, although it'll be a different version of Othello from the one that you've heard. Let me start with something that you'll all be familiar with, A.C. Bradley's Shakespearean tragedy. And this is what A.C. Bradley has to say about Macbeth. He says, whether Macbeth had children, or as it seems usually to be supposed had none, is quite immaterial, unquote. But even though he was well aware of the constraints of theatrical narrative, he couldn't help himself, and he went on to speculate that Lady Macbeth's child may be alive or may be dead. It may even be, or have been, her child by a former husband. Though if Shakespeare had followed history in making Macbeth marry a widow, as some writers gravely assume, he would probably have told us so. Now, Bradley's often been taken to task for treating Shakespeare's characters as though they were real people. And in the case of Lady Macbeth, he gestures to what we call a backstory that hints at a private life and a personal psychology. In the same note, he qualifies his comment on the immateriality of whether Macbeth had children or not with the speculation that, and I quote, it is material that if he had none, he looked forward to having one, unquote. And he justifies this speculation by pointing to the lines at Act 3, Scene 1, where Macbeth muses on the prophecy that the Weird Sisters gave to Banquo. He says, upon my head they placed a fruitless crown and put a barren sceptre in my gripe, thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, no son of mine succeeding. Now this speaks to Macbeth's state of mind and provides some motivation for his violent actions. Indeed, what Bradley speculates on here makes it difficult for us to distinguish between the dramatic character's consciousness, his preconsciousness, and his unconscious. When we do that, we take the discussion of character beyond the play and into the realm of what we might call a case study. Now, Macbeth would seem to be an appropriate case because so much of the play gestures in the direction of waking and dreaming that Freud discusses in his monumental interpretation of dreams that first appeared in 1896, some 8 years before Bradley's Shakespearean tragedy. Now, Macbeth is also a play in which the unconscious figures in a very specific way. At Act 2, Scene 1, Banquo and his son Fleance are preparing for bed. Banquo is disturbed because although he recognizes that there is husbandry in heaven, he can't sleep. He says, a heavy summons lies like lead upon me, and yet I would not sleep. Merciful powers, restrain in me those thoughts that nature gives way to in repose. Now, what are those cursed thoughts that come flooding in when nature drops her guard? Now, this is what Freud has got to say about dreams. He says, dreams are disconnected. They accept the most violent contradictions without the least objection. They admit impossibilities. They disregard knowledge, which carries great weight with us in the daytime. They reveal us as ethical and moral imbeciles. Anyone who, when he was awake, behaved in the sort of way that is shown in situations in dreams would be considered insane. Anyone, when he was awake, talked in the sort of way that people talk in dreams or described the sort of things that happen in dreams would give us the impression of being muddle-headed or feeble-minded. Now, much later in the analysis, Freud goes on to elaborate the connection between hallucinatory dreams and what he calls regression, which he traces back to the 13th century scholastic Albertus Magnus, and which involves the construction of dreams, quote, out of the stored up images of sensory objects. And the process, he says, is carried out in a reverse direction to that of the waking life, unquote. Now, this is the mechanism that we find in early modern explanations of dreams, in which they are the residue of the day's activities. And we can trace this back to Aristotle's short treatise on dreams, and then forward to Thomas Hill's interpretation of dreams, which appeared in 1576. Now, in Banquo's case, the sensory experience, the cursed thoughts, is the meeting with the weird sisters and their prophecy. I dreamt last night, he says, of the 3 weird sisters. Now, all he fears is that the fulfillment of their partial truth in relation to Macbeth may encourage him to act. Banquo resists yet fears, whereas Macbeth proceeds in a direction that makes of the nightmare that Banquo fears a living reality for the tyrant who has murdered sleep and also all of its restorative powers. Immediately following the encounter with Banquo, Macbeth hallucinates in that he imagines a dagger. He says, "Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat of an oppressed brain? I see thee yet in form as palpable as this which now I draw. Thou marshallest me the way I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest." Now we can now see much more clearly what the cursed thoughts that Banquo fears are. Indeed, what Shakespeare does here is to dramatize a whole theory of dreaming as a means of access to the mind of the pathological tyrant. This is something that Freud extends to encompass the activity of the creative writer. For example, in his essay, Creative Writing and Daydreaming, he has this to say. He says, "The relation of a fantasy to time is in general very important. We may say that it hovers, as it were, between 3 times, the 3 moments of time which our ideation involves. Mental work is linked to some current impression, some provoking occasion in the present, which has been able to arouse one of the subject's major wishes. From there, it harks back to a memory of an earlier experience, usually an infantile one, in which this wish was fulfilled, and it now creates a situation in relation to the future which represents a fulfillment of the wish. What it thus creates is a daydream or fantasy which carries about it traces of its origins from the occasion which provoked it and from the memory." Now, where Shakespeare differs from Freud is in the issue of the memory of an earlier experience, with the parenthesis, usually an infantile one. Now, Macbeth has harboured ambitions, thoughts, and this is the enterprise to which Lady Macbeth refers. But those thoughts are generated by the power structure over which the violently patriarchal Duncan presides. It's that power that's imprinted upon Macbeth's memory that leads to his present dilemma, as ambition collides with morality, and to a future which, once that power has been secured, turns out to be other than the Macbeths imagined. Here, the dramatist's fantasy is projected onto the protagonist, and the result is a complex dialectic between the desire for power and the restraints that act as impediments to its achievement. We'd be hard-pressed to read into this earlier infantile experience, or indeed any experience beyond the current realities of power that the play makes explicit. Now, in the case of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, the sensory retrogressive world of murder and the moral resistance to it continually rise to overwhelm, indeed obliterate, the restorative powers of sleep. Except, of course, as I've just said, all this is made explicit in Shakespeare's play. Indeed, even what we might identify as Banquo's unconscious is oddly quite conscious to him, as indeed is Macbeth's pathology. Each represents one side of a spectrum that encompasses good and evil, but the contents of the 2 extremes are made abundantly clear and do not require to be interpreted or read in relation to some wholly extrinsic, ahistorical, symbolic structure. Of course, the play's representations of order and disorder have a wider historical context, but the behaviour of the dramatic characters is transparent from the point of view of the theatrical spectators. Now, the contours of Banquo's dream and Macbeth's living nightmare was rehearsed in the earlier play, Richard III, in Clarence's dream, in which Richard's brother, imprisoned in the Tower, dreams of past crimes, broken oaths, and future retribution, and he's drowning as he fell into the sea from a ship, He says, as we paced along upon the giddy footing of the hatches, methought that Gloucester stumbled, and in falling struck me that thought to stay him overboard into the tumbling billows of the main. Now Clarence is drowned, what a way to die, in a barrel of wine. But at the end of the play, he appears again in ghost form in the dreams of Richard and Richmond, where the ghosts of Richard's victims rise to confront him and to offer support to the cause of Richmond. The cause of the chaos attendant on Richard's tyranny is, as in the case of Macbeth later, political ambition. Though in the earlier play, Richard's literal rather than Macbeth's metaphorical deformity, which of course is given a history there that stretches back to infancy, is identified by him as the effective cause of his villainy. He says, I that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty, to strut before an ambling wanton nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Now, the ardent III editor of Richard III, James Seaman, observes that in the case of Richard, in its universality, he says, Freud's figure of wounded self-love that we feel parallels a relevant theological construct. And that construct is outlined in Richard's opening soliloquy, although Seaman posits a universality that is, in this case, a feature of a historically specific moment of Christian thought. In his essay on psychopathic characters on the stage, that begins with the experience of the theatre spectator, Freud draws attention to what in tragedies he calls a struggle against divinity. And he argues that a tragedy of this kind is one of rebellion, in which the dramatist and the audience take the side of the rebel. The less belief there comes to be in divinity, the more important becomes the human regulation of affairs. And it's this which with increasing insight comes to be held responsible for suffering. Now we can see the difficulty that this produces in a protagonist such as Richard III or Macbeth, that requires us to be both sympathetic and censorious. But in the work of Shakespeare and many of his contemporaries, the power of patriarchy can be seen as both the glue that holds society together, but also a potentially destructive force. Perhaps the most obvious example is to be found in the briefest of references to a dream in Othello. At the beginning of Shakespeare's play, Iago and Rodrigo awake Brabantio, Desdemona's father, with the allegation that your heart is burst, you have lost your soul, even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. Arise, arise, awake the snorting citizens with the bell, or else the devil will make a grandsire of you. Arise, I say. Now, Iago then elaborates on this scenario. You'll have your daughter, he says, covered with a Barbary horse. You'll have your nephews neigh to you. You'll have courses for cousins and jennets for Germans. And he goes on, your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs. Now, Rodrigo tones down this discourse, but he invites Brabantio to go and check if his daughter's at home. Brabantio's response is this: give me a taper. Call up all of my people. This accident is not unlike my dream. Belief of it oppresses me already. Now, the obvious question here is, what does Brabantio dream? He first resists by insisting that this is Venice, my house is not a grange. That's to say that Venice is a place that welcomes strangers such as Othello, and it's a civilized place. But within 90 lines, he likens the prospect of his daughter's absence from his house to an oppressive dream. The contours of his dream are as follows: that his daughter has eloped with a Moor, and that they are now consummating a misogynistic relationship that the father, Brabantio, finds oppressive. Now, if we think of Rodrigo as the first of Iago's victims, then Brabantio is the second, although the situation here is more complex. Here, Desdemona will, as she herself later explains, have divided loyalties. She says, my noble father, I perceive here a divided duty. To you I'm bound for life and education. My life and education to learn me how to respect you. You're the lord of duty. I am hitherto your daughter. But here's my husband. And so much duty as my mother showed to you, preferring you before her father, so much I challenge that I may profess to my lord the more. Now, Desdemona here challenges her father as the lord of duty. And this is the role that's then taken over by her husband, Othello. Now, to cut a long story short, we might say that what happens very quickly in relation to the father is projected onto the son-in-law, who's made to doubt the integrity of his wife and his capacity to control her behavior. We might say that Desdemona rebels against the power of patriarchy in relation to her father, only to become a victim of it in relation to her husband, who proceeds to inherit a power of life and death over her. Brabantio's fear is the fear of patriarchy. But it's not a fear that's repressed in the Freudian sense of the term, as though, as you'll see later, its energies can be displaced into other areas of Venetian life. Rather, it rises to the surface very easily indeed, and it's predicated upon a particular masculine view of Venetian femininity. And yet even this view of femininity can be challenged later in the play by the waiting woman Emilia, when she blames female behavior on the example set by men. She says, "Let husbands know their wives have sense like them. They see, they smell, and have their palates both for sweet and sour as husbands have. What is it that they do when they change us for others? Is it sport? I think it is. And doth affection breed it? I think it does. Is frailty that thus heirs? It is so too. And have we not affections, desires for sport, and frailties as men have? Then let them use us well. Else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so." Now, at its extreme, we could perhaps argue that the anxiety to which both Emilia and Desdemona seem to be referring here risks deteriorating into an hysteria. Earlier in the play, and with the dehumanizing of Othello, we could argue that beneath the surface of Venetian consciousness is a kind of animal phobia that Venetian propaganda represses. Freud explains animal phobia as a drive impulse under repression, which is, he says, a libidinal attitude towards the father coupled with fear of him. But he goes on, he says, after repression, this impulse disappears from consciousness. The father's no longer present here as a libidinal object. And consequently, a need for love from the father is replaced by a fear of a particular animal. The question is, can we read Brabantio's and Desdemona's respective behaviors in these terms? I am not convinced. Desdemona is clearly not afraid of her father, and she also rejects the dehumanizing of Othello, to whom she transfers her affections. What the play uncovers is the division within the female subjects, whose anxieties are caused by the obligation that she transfer her duty from father to husband. And it's this that produces patriarchal anxiety in Venice. If there's an unconscious in this play, then the geographical space in which it's located is Venice, where libidinal investment proceeds alongside the institution of marriage. I'll come back later to Othello for another reason. But what I want now to do is to leave the discussion of Macbeth suspended and come to Hamlet, because this play has been the subject of a particularly Freudian reading by one of Freud's own disciples, Ernest Jones. Now, in the interpretation of dreams, Freud himself had one or two things to say about the play, in particularly the claim that Shakespeare's Hamlet has its roots in the same soil as Oedipus Rex. He says, in the Oedipus, the child's wishful fantasy that underlies it is brought into the open and realized as it would be in a dream. In Hamlet, it remains repressed. And just as in the case of neurosis, We only learn of its existence from its inhibiting consequences. And Freud goes on to say that he's translated into conscious terms what was bound to remain unconscious in Hamlet's mind. And if anyone is inclined to call him a hysteric, he says, I can only accept the fact as one that is implied by my interpretation. The distaste of sexuality expressed by Hamlet in his conversation with Ophelia fits in very well with this, he says. Now, Freud concludes that this distaste spreads across Shakespeare's later plays and is a feature that affects the dramatist's own creative powers. Now, this is the point from which Ernest Jones begins his analysis of Hamlet. Jones says, the deeper unconscious mind, which is doubtless the ultimate source of such ideas, as of all abstract ideas, is comprised of mental material which in its native form is incompatible with the standards of the conscious mind, this being the reason for its being kept unconscious, material which has to be extensively transformed and purified before it could be presented to consciousness. Now, Jones goes on to identify what he thinks of as a distinguishing feature of dramatic art. He says, characters are created whose impersonating representatives act and move on the stage, and we're asked to believe that they are living persons. Indeed, the dramatist's success is largely measured by this criterion, one in which Shakespeare was superbly preeminent. Now, A.C. Bradley's focus on character here is given a particular twist, since Jones adds to the concept a psychological dimension, and he argues that, quote, in the same sense as a character in a play is taken as a living person, to that extent must he have had a life before the action in the play began, since no one starts life as an adult. Now, what Jones does is to adapt the Aristotelian notion of mimesis to mean not the imitation of an action, but the imitation of a character. Although part of the creative process is to select materials so that an artist does not convey all he wishes to solely in matter-of-fact literalness. In other words, we supply the missing information from our imaginations. Our response, Jones continues, to the artist's creative effort always implies a reading between the lines on our part, an extension of what he has actually written, provided always that our imagination is in tune with his and never departs from it. Now, reading between the lines is an important concept insofar as it involves reading and interpreting what the dramatist has actually written as a series of symptoms. In Freudian psychology, the key to understanding these symptoms lies in a particular mapping of the individual unconscious. It's perhaps worth commenting in passing on the different kinds of symptomatic reading that critics now have at their disposal. For example, the reaction to Bradley directed L.C. Knights to a study of recurrent themes in Shakespeare's plays. While in the case of a critic such as Terry Eagleton, brushing texts against the grain, getting beneath the manifest content to what lies beneath them, is designed to uncover the material histories that lie behind the character's actions. In other words, a Freudian unconscious, with its emphasis upon the individual character's particular identity, is replaced by what the critic Frederick Jameson calls a political unconscious that makes of identity a much wider social and historical issue. Now, for the Marxist Jameson, the individual text becomes, quote, refocused as a parole or individual utterance of that vaster system of class discourse, unquote. Now, on this rewriting, he continues, the individual utterance or text is grasped as a symbolic move in an essentially polemic and strategic ideological confrontation between the classes. Now, Jameson switches attention from Freud's preoccupation with individual psychic life to the social and political relations of society, and much post-Freudian analysis adapts and reapplies some of the categories of Freudian analysis to these latter concerns. Now, I mention this briefly here since we'll encounter partial versions of this shift in emphasis when we come to look at Andre Green's account of Othello. But to return to Jones and Hamlet, He begins by investigating Hamlet's apparent reluctance to act, and he rejects the view that here we have a gentle soul crushed by a colossal task for that of a strong man tortured by some mysterious inhibition. Indeed, Jones insists that as far as the external situation is concerned, the task was a possible one and was regarded as such by Hamlet, and that he is, quote, suffering from an internal conflict, the essential nature of which is inaccessible to his introspection, unquote. He is, according to Jones, suffering from a deficient willpower that is localized to the one question of killing his uncle. It's what may be termed a specific abulia, unquote. And abulia, by the way, is an excessive neurotic brooding. Now, Hamlet's tortured conscience, if I can use Jones's phrase, to some hidden ground for shirking his task. And this points to a tendency that's inaccessible to consciousness, and that is, to use Freud's term, repressed. Now, in Freudian terms, repression occurs when images, memories, and thoughts that are connected to an instinct are driven down into the unconscious and that re-emerge in illnesses and that result in extreme cases in particular kinds of extreme behavior, such as hysteria. Now, according to Jones, a Freudian diagnosis of psychoneurosis, in which a person is unduly and often painfully driven or thwarted by the unconscious part of his mind, that buried part that was once the infant's mind and still lives on side by side with the adult mentality that's developed out of it and should have taken its place, can now be applied to Hamlet's behavior. Now, this leads Jones to the following conclusion that he puts in the form of a hypothesis. He says, how if in fact Hamlet had in years gone by, as a child, bitterly resented having had to share his mother's affection, even with his own father, and had regarded him as a rival, and had secretly wished him out of the way that he might enjoy undisputed and undisturbed the monopoly of that affection. Now, Jones's claim is that Claudius's murder of Hamlet's father provides the trigger to activate these repressed memories, and the resulting depression is an obscure aftermath of his childhood's conflict. Now, Jones then corroborates this from the domain of clinical psychology with the conclusion that this is at all events the mechanism that is actually found in the real Hamlets who are investigated psychologically. And I emphasize real Hamlets here. Now, at the root of this is Freud's account of the Oedipus complex that he describes in his interpretation of dreams. There he begins by stating that Oedipus Rex is what is known as a tragedy of destiny, although he goes on to modify this account, insisting that it points to a universal situation. His Oedipus's destiny moves us only because it might have been ours, because the oracle laid the same curse upon us before our birth as upon him. It's the fate of all of us, perhaps, to direct our first sexual impulse towards our mother, and our first hatred and our murderous wish against our father. Our dreams convince us that it is so. Now, Freud sees an adjustment of this pattern in Hamlet. In Sophocles' play, the child's wishful fantasy that underlies it is brought into the open and realized as it would be a dream. But in Hamlet, it remains repressed, and just as in the case of neurosis, he says, we only learn of its existence from its inhibiting consequences. It's precisely this that allows Ernest Jones to read Hamlet's symptoms as though he were a psychiatrist's patient, so that he can say that as a child, Hamlet had experienced the warmest affection for his mother, and this, as is always so, had contained elements of a disguised erotic quality, still more so in infancy, unquote. Jones drags Ophelia into this equation, claiming that Hamlet displaces some of the old attraction for the mother onto her. Gertrude's marriage to Claudius, according to this argument, forces Hamlet, quote, to connect the thought of his mother with sensuality, unquote. And it's this that leads to an intense revulsion. Along with this, he says, is a fierce jealousy unconscious because of its forbidden origin at the sight of her giving herself to another man, a man whom he has no reason whatever either to love or to respect, unquote. Now this, then, is the family romance that Jones narrates, built upon a particular reading of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, and it's one that Freud himself develops by emphasizing one particular element of the ancient Greek play. Of course, in Sophocles' play, Oedipus does not have a complex. Indeed, Oedipus's father Laius and his mother Jocasta do everything they can to avoid what the gods have mapped out for their son, and Oedipus's search for his own identity involves both an acknowledgement of his kinship ties and a recognition that within the larger scheme of things, what the gods decree cannot be avoided. So what Freud does is to invent, in the best creative sense, an unconscious for Sophocles' hero that distorts the complexity of the myth, and Jones dutifully follows suit. That the case of Hamlet should be projected back onto Shakespeare's own autobiography, in particular the death of his own father, and then onto the death of Shakespeare's son Hamlet, makes of the Freudian explanation a coherent narrative based on a set of universal trans-historical assumptions. Now, we can of course find other reasons for Hamlet's disgust for his mother and for his attitude to Claudius and to Ophelia, many of which we can excavate from the play and that don't require us to read between the lines in Jones's sense. The famous Laurence Olivier film of Hamlet that has Gertrude give Hamlet a very sensuous kiss at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 2, and Claudius reacts suspiciously to it. Also, later in the film, the royal bed is draped with a series of folded curtains that resemble female genitalia, all of which Freud and Jones might have approved. But Hamlet takes the cue for his disgust from the ghost's narrative, and we remember that old Hamlet is poisoned through the ear by Claudius, a gesture that is recognizably satanic. If Claudius is a type of Satan in the play, then Gertrude is a type of Eve. Now, in his book, The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve, Stephen Greenblatt has suggested that at times of political and social unrest, time has a strange way of buckling, with the present seeming to collapse into the past, or the past bursting its containment and inhabiting the present. Now, we could argue, of course, that for Freud and Jones, the Oedipus legend does something similar, although Greenblatt isn't concerned in his treatment of Adam and Eve with universals in the way that they are. For Greenblatt, the Adam and Eve story involved the search for origins and for a lost innocence, and for what we would now think of as a naivety that the complex present has perverted, even though, as Greenblatt suggests, the story of Adam and Eve seemed eerily close to 16th century culture. Now, we might also rethink the issue of Hamlet's delay. For Jones and Freud, the reason is psychological, and its roots go back to the character's repressed childhood desires. At only one point in the play does Hamlet offer a comment on how Claudius's regicide has affected him. Late in the play, and after the return from his sea voyage, Hamlet says this to Horatio. He says, "He hath killed my king and whored my mother, popped in between the election and my hopes, thrown out his angle on my proper life, and with such cozenage, is not perfect conscience." And there's a folio edition of 2 lines to this play. It goes on to say, "And is not perfect conscience to quit him with this arm, and is not to be damned to let this canker of our nature come in further evil." Hamlet here is saying that he expected to be nominated by his father, my king, as successor, in the way that he later nominates Fortinbras, but that the succession has been perverted by an agent of evil, this canker of our nature. Now, Hamlet's attitude to his mother is made explicit in the closet scene, Act 3, Scene 4, and his revulsion is not a consequence of repression, but the result of a very clear sense of what she's done. He says, "Such an act that blurs the grace and blush of modesty, calls virtue hypocrite, takes the rose from the fair forehead of an innocent love and sets a blister there, makes marriage vows as false as Deuce's oaths. Oh, such a deed as from the body of contraction plucks the very soul, and sweet religion makes a rhapsody of words. Heaven's face does glow o'er this solidity and compound mass, with heated visage as against the doom is thought sick at the act. Now, I've quoted this in full because it's often overlooked, and it's not in the slightest Freudian. Later, when the incensed laity enters, he plans to overthrow everything that here Hamlet seeks to preserve and that he thinks his mother has violated. The phrase rhapsody of words is glossed by the Ardent Three editor as a mere confusion or frenzy of words, which is, of course, the OED gloss for an obsolete meaning. But it also means a stringing together of random verses, which is also an obsolete meaning, and it's one that addresses Claudius's particular use of language, and especially his habit of separating words from thoughts. And this is also Hamlet's problem. How can he represent to himself an action, such as the particular kind of revenge he's been instructed to undertake, when the very means of understanding it, language, has been so devalued by Claudius and his court? Like Claudius, Hamlet sometimes sinks to the level where he admits that I, the son of a dear murdered, prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell, must like a whore unpack my heart with words and fall a-cursing like a very drab, a very scullion. Now, my point is here that a Freudian reading reduces Shakespeare's play to a formula that we need to accept as a particular explanation of how the human mind actually works underneath what the text actually offers. In other words, there's a danger here that one fiction, Shakespeare's play, is subjected to another fiction, Freud's Oedipus complex, that makes a number of empirically based claims taken from research into particular kinds of diseased minds about how the play's unconscious works. Now, there's a lot more we can say about Hamlet, but I want now to go back to Othello. And I want to do that first through Stephen Greenblatt's essay, Psychoanalysis and Renaissance Culture, which he produced in 1990. Now, Greenblatt's unhappy with Freudian psychoanalysis as a method of reading early modern texts simply because Freud's unwillingness to dispense with a primal creatural individuation becomes a burden. And this is what he says of the Oedipus complex. Along with the secret of incestuous fantasy, the Oedipus myth discloses the tragic inescapability of continuous selfhood. Now, Greenblatt offers another account of identity that privileges what the philosopher Thomas Hobbes describes as the artificial person. Now, this is the self that is fashioned as something other than a defensive strategy, a veneer hiding an authentic self beneath, which is the foundation upon which psychoanalysis is built. Indeed, he concludes that there's no layer deeper, more authentic than the theatrical self-representation, unquote. Now, if we apply this to a play such as Hamlet, we can begin to see a tension between the self-theatrical representational identity and the various roles that the play's personae undertake within the larger social structure that the play creates and to which each respond, which is, of course, Shakespeare's version of the drama. Now, this is now not therefore a psychology that works from the inside out, that's dependent upon a pre-existing symbolic structure such as Freud's Oedipus complex. This is perhaps a difficult concept for us to grasp, but it brings into focus the emphasis upon theatrical representation and Shakespeare's own insistence that all the world's a stage. The issue only becomes fraught when a gap develops between the inner and the outer. And it's usually Shakespeare's villains who exploit the resulting tension, even when, as in the case of Claudius explicitly, there's an existing religious discourse within which to frame the dilemma. Or in the case of Gertrude or Ophelia, where built into female identity is a quasi-religious capacity for deception. In the case of Andre Green's version of Othello, we get a glimpse of these tensions in a play where there's a clear conflict between inner and outer, and where social roles determine behavior. In this play, gendered and heroic selves are shaped from without, and ultimately, in the case of the eponymous hero, the body itself becomes the casualty of the splitting of the self. Othello is a Venetian, and he is a Turk. Now, Andre Green begins his account of Othello in his book, The Tragic Effect, with a direct question. He says, what is a psychoanalytical reading? And he offers two responses. One, he says, that Shakespeare's writing offers a rich source of knowledge about man. And two, Shakespeare is investigator of the human characteristics that throw a bridge between that humanity of which all men are a part and the humanity that belongs to the proper field of the psychoanalyst, that of neurosis and psychosis. Now, we might note here that in the second condition, a universal claim, the humanity of all which men are a part, and that aspect of this universal humanity that is the proper field of the psychoanalysis. Now, Green starts from the proposition that Othello is a play about jealousy, and that it's Freud who offers us an analytical theory of jealousy. Ergo, Shakespeare's play is a suitable text for a psychoanalytical reading. Now, there are a number of preliminary observations with which we can readily agree. For example, that Othello is a play written to be performed, to be represented, seems obvious. And this, he says, implies the existence, therefore, not so much of a reader as of a spectator, a listener who is to be involved. Also, no problem. Also, that there is a distance between the hero's native country and the city of the Doge. Statement of fact. And also that the sociological aspect of the play offers a context for the alienation of the protagonist. Okay, bit more complex, but yes, we consent to that. Green also identifies, perhaps more tenuously, two worlds in the play, that of men and that of the gods. Now, an observation that brings us nearer to the classical Oedipal model of tragedy that's the basis for Freud's understanding of the tensions that play across the human subject. Green acknowledges what he calls a human world in the play, in which he identifies three classes. The class of power, the class of pleasure, which includes Desdemona, and the class of war, each of which, either separately or collectively, exert a pressure on the behaviour of the characters and on the action of the play. Now, for Green, Iago is not what Coleridge called a motiveless malignity. Indeed, he suggests that there's an ultimate motive for his action, although he still regards it as a mystery. He goes on to regard the action of the play as, quote, the trial of insane jealousy. And it's the adjective insane that gives the psychoanalytic critic an opening into what he will then go on to provide, a particular kind of account that imposes a pattern and an explanation for the play's depiction of neurosis and psychosis that he can then read as a discourse. In passing, he observes correctly that Othello replaces Brabantio, although he makes of it an Oedipal drama in two senses. Firstly, he says Othello has abandoned the Moorish gods of his birth and has also turned away from the Christian god who wishes to have nothing to do with him, and he says that together they make him pay for his conversion with his life. And secondly, because he says political power is linked with paternal power under the emblem of the phallic signifier, that Othello must take in Desdemona's eyes the place of the father from whom he took her. Now, at the root of this tangled web is the issue of desire, and what in this case becomes a series of perversions as unconscious material is slowly brought in condensed or displaced form into the open. And it's to the Freudian theory of perversion that Green appeals as he unravels a sequence of family romances that he thinks lies at the heart of the tragedy. Now, it's difficult to know how much of the teachings of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan Green has absorbed, since he resorts to a conservative Freudian account of female subjectivity in his analysis of the role of Desdemona. Firstly, even after having sought to account for the ways in which power circulates in Venice, Green concludes mysteriously that jealousy is jealousy. It is inexplicable. It is without foundation. Now, in the play, Othello's jealousy is in fact without foundation. in a strictly literal sense. But jealousy as such is perfectly explicable, as indeed is Othello's alienation in sociological and/or cultural terms. And it's these that Iago manipulates. Indeed, it's in the link between patriarchal power and possession and the ambivalence of the transfer of power from father to husband that its instabilities are revealed. But secondly, Othello's acknowledgement of Desdemona as, "O my fair warrior," upon greeting her when she arrives in Cyprus, is Green claims suggestive of the view that his love for her, quote, "has passed through the medium of Desdemona's desire to be herself a man like Othello." This brings together the narcissistic love in which Othello's desire takes root and his object love, with which Othello finds it so difficult to accommodate himself when it concerns a female castrated being. Now the question is, do we need a programmatic explanation of this kind, involving a subtextual account of threats of castration that shape male and female identity, to account for the violence the jealousy provokes in this case? Especially since the play itself is unusually explicit in the way in which it shapes both male and female subjectivity, and is quite explicit about those elements of the mobility of male desire that might also, as we saw, be appropriate, surprisingly, for female desire. Now, Green wants to complicate this picture by offering a psychoanalytical explanation of the various triangular structures in the play. These triangular structures are as follows: Othello, Iago, Desdemona, Othello, Brabantio, Desdemona, Othello, Iago, Cassio, and on top of all that, the mobility of desire. Now, at the root of Green's analysis is the Oedipus complex that he describes in the following way. From 1923 onwards, Freud showed the existence of a double Oedipus complex, both positive and negative, the second being the reverse of the first. These two terms occupy one end of the chain, of which the only trace that has survived, repression, remain. The girl is subject to the same structure as the boy. As a result, the human being of either sex carries within, by the very fact of human bisexuality, a double identification, masculine and feminine, the seal of Oedipus. It follows, therefore, that the Oedipus complex is at least quadruple, positive and negative, masculine and feminine for each individual. Now, according to Green, this works itself out in what he thinks of as the kernel of truth in Othello. And the kernel of truth turns out to be Desdemona's love for Cassio, which is complemented by Othello's desire for Cassio. Now, it's important to note that Green sees this desire as homosexual, whereas, as we shall see, a homosocial erotics of the kind that preserves patriarchal relations might just as easily explain the relationship. Moreover, according to Green, Iago's plotting lays the foundation for jealousy because he says it causes Desdemona to reveal her desire in defending the disgraced lieutenant. Now, what Iago's retelling of Cassio's dream at Act 3, Scene 3 sets before our eyes, he tells us, is a spectacle that serves as a bait of identification, in which Othello can see himself in Iago's place, madly embraced and kissed by Cassio, except that Iago subtly persuades Othello that he is not Iago, but Desdemona. Now, this is not quite the same thing as Othello fantasizing that he is Iago Desdemona, and that this should signal a repressed homosexual desire for Iago. It's important in all these fantasies that Othello sees Desdemona committing acts of adultery, even though the personnel change with each elaboration of the fantasy. Now, this fantasy is extended and intensified when Iago invites Othello to overhear the dialogue between Cassio and himself in relation to Bianca, where, in this case, the white Bianca, that's what her name means, is assumed to be sullied by an imaginary promiscuity. Having prepared the ground for the deception of Othello, Bianca enters, and the issue of the handkerchief is resurrected. Here, the passage of the handkerchief from one hand to another reaffirms in Othello's mind the passage of Desdemona Bianca's virginity from one man to another in a gesture that poses a radical threat to masculine authority. This brings together Iago's animosity to the Florentine Michael Cassio for usurping his professional position and his revenge on Othello the Moor for upsetting the professional and domestic structures of Venetian social life. This issue here is a complex one of class, in which questions of gender and race are also involved. Now, what Green is doing here is reading particular episodes in the play symbolically, according to a particular aspect of Freudian psychology. The result is that while we may recognize parts of the play, it's difficult to make a clear sense of what he suggests lies under the surface. Green's treatment of the lost handkerchief is a case in point. He begins by stating that the handkerchief emerges from a matrilineal source, seconded by the help of sorceresses, possessing a power of creation engendered solely by female forces, produced from the heart of these virgins, whose only knowledge of desire is the traces left by the absence of its fulfillment, unquote. And so, therefore, for him, it is a signifier of desire whose signification is apprehended only when it is missing. Now, Green also links it with castration, and that its absence provokes an epileptic fit, as well as depriving Othello of phallic power. But more than that, in being persuaded that Desdemona is a whore, Othello is remembering the infidelity of all women, the first of which was the mother when the child discovered for the first time the existence of secret relations where she has with the father, says Green. Now, it's at times like this that elements of the Oedipal surface to explain what lies under the surface of the play. And it's true that Othello demands ocular proof of Desdemona's infidelity. And it's true that the claims that Iago makes of her behavior have a devastating effect on him. But there's no way to verify or refute the narrative that Green produces, because everything hinges on a series of repressions that are claimed to exist beneath the explicit level of the play's narrative, and for which Green himself supplies an additional narrative. Let's start by unpicking the repressed relationship between Othello and Iago. The play begins by Iago revealing to Rodrigo that he is not what he is. Now, we later observe that Othello isn't what he is either. He's a black man with a white heart. Green argues, quote, honesty is on the side of the black and blackness on the side of the white, unquote. But he also claims that Othello and Iago are two sides of a single character, although he says Shakespeare does his utmost to present them to us as utterly unlike each other, united by their very contrast. Now, it's the case excuse me. It's the case that Othello comes to resemble Iago as he's drawn into jealousy. Iago's motives extend and embroider those that Othello comes to harbour about Desdemona. Although what Othello represses, according to Green, is that he wants Desdemona to be like his mother, and that she should be like the mother of earliest childhood, the mother as yet untouched by castration, provided with the veil which hides her face from the world, unquote. Now, wanting Desdemona to be like his mother is one thing, although what's at issue here is the relation between his mother and his father, and the handkerchief that counters the mobility of sexual desire. If we take this into consideration, then there's another explanation for the handkerchief. Othello says that his mother's possession of the handkerchief would make her amiable and subdue my father entirely to her love. He says, but if she lost it, or made a gift of it, my father's eye should hold her loathed, and his spirits should hunt after new fancies. Now, this testifies both to the potential mobility of desire and to the power of matriarchy, which the play presents as conditional. And it's this important backstory that Othello later explains in what appears to be an attempt to replicate this pattern with Desdemona, and thereby to affirm matrimonial union. But can we say any more than this? Well, indeed we can, because here the figure of the mother woman mysteriously guarantees that what Julia Kristeva would call her unsymbolized instinctual drives can be settled, quieted, and bestowed upon the mother in order to maintain the ultimate guarantee. That ultimate guarantee turns out to be symbolic coherence. Isn't this exactly what Othello recognizes when he reveals that it's Desdemona whose love embodies order or symbolic coherence? Excellent wretch, he says, perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee. And when I love thee not, chaos is come again. Now, symbolic coherence in the play is represented both as natural and as something that is persistently violated, in that for the early modern English imagination, Venice is a place of libidinal excess and at the same time of a revolutionary social order, a republic. But the shell in which Green encapsulates the play's central problem omits this and settles for a version of the Oedipus complex. He says, in the final analysis then, Othello is a brother of Oedipus and Orestes. He's gone to live in a foreign country, far from his father's sight. In saving himself from the desire to castrate his father, he's been unable to avoid satisfying his desire in the person of Brabantio. This father arouses desire, which can only be conveyed through some talisman. He's the one to whom submission is due in that unconsciousness of homosexual desire which bars jouissance in the love object. But unlike Oedipus, Othello is not escaping from divine decree, nor is he ignorant of his identity. In fact, he has two identities, one as a Venetian and another as an outsider, a stranger, a foreigner, a Turk. But the problem is that they coexist within one body, and they affect domestic, sexual, and political relations. Iago's Venetian Machiavellianism is of a piece, and is the result of a duplicity generated by professional frustration. But it's also part of what Jonathan Dollemois has described as, quote, the typical double focus of masculine sexual jealousy and a major instability in homosocial bonding, unquote. What he visits on Othello is a version of that duplicity through jealousy, which here is also the undermining of patriarchal authority and domestic sexual relations. Of course, Desdemona's elopement with Othello has already undermined her father's authority, but this is also a problem with the female in the play, as we've seen, and with the identity that Venetian patriarchy prescribes for her. We recall that it's Emilia who identifies this problem as explicitly a problem with patriarchy. And this is what the second half of the speech I referred to earlier actually makes plain. Perhaps we can now begin to see a little more clearly why Greenblatt works from the outside in relation to the dramatic persona, and not the way in which psychoanalysis operates, treating the outside as symptomatic. Now, if we extend this whole argument a little further, we can say that Venice is an unstable republic, and that instability reaches directly into its fantasy life. We recall Brabantio's dream, a nightmare in which an animal devil cohabits with his daughter. Othello will be persuaded to entertain a similar fantasy, as he's persuaded to imagine Cassio dreaming of Desdemona, and later Desdemona as a lewd minx and a fair devil. Now, within this network of fantasies, the handkerchief comes to represent empirical proof of Desdemona's violated chastity. Iago's proof is, of course, a caricature of empirical process, in that, like his earlier persuasion of Brabantio, it begins with only partial evidence and from a foregone conclusion. Indeed, if Othello is ignorant, then so is Roderigo and Brabantio, and we should not forget that. We might contrast Iago's caricature of empirical method with the Duke's process at Act 1, Scene 3, where he spends some time weighing the contradictory evidence before deciding on the Turk's final naval destination. Only then will he commit to action. For Iago, where the facts don't fit, he invents them. But his inventions are plausible, and they trade on the instabilities that shape the Venetian political unconscious. Dollimore sees these inventions as evidence of massive internal manipulations and betrayals that ironically reveal the vicissitudes and displacements occurring as one of their enabling conditions. And he continues, he says, as ordered government is the antithesis of anarchy, so natural love, heterosexual, patriarchal, is the opposite of sexual deviation. This structure is given the lie by the perverse dynamic, which indicates that political and sexual ordering is always internally disordered by the deviations it produces and displaces and defines itself against. This is one reason why patriarchy might imagine the greatest threat to its erupting from within, that those which it most powerfully controls, the household and women. The foreign erupts within the domestic. Now, this is a tangled net indeed, and one for which there's no single key to understanding. While we might, as indeed Dollimore and others do, deploy certain elements of a Freudian vocabulary, such as condensation, displacement, to chart the mobility of the forces in this play, we still need to ask why why Venice should be the focus of the play. Now, the answer to this question might be a little more straightforward. Venice was, in the early modern period, as I've already suggested, a republic. It was not the kind of monarchic republic that prevailed in England, and it was a trade crossroads that welcomed strangers. In the earlier play, The Merchant of Venice, the stranger is the Jew, Shylock, and he is unwelcome in Venice. But like Shylock in the sphere of economics, Venice depends upon Othello to protect itself militarily against external threats that turn out to be internal. It's not, as the late A.D. Nuttall once claimed, that Othello's tragedy was the story of a hero who went into a house. Rather, that the household and the public political life of Venice are brought into contact with each other, so that what happens externally also happens internally. The psychic and the political are two sides of the same coin in Venice, a geographical location that is never quite what it seems. Indeed, the instabilities that the play attributes to Venice act as a cautionary example to the monarchical Republic of England that was only just beginning in 1604 to feel some of the pressures that were barely half a century later to produce a revolution. So, where does all this take us? We began with Brabantio's dream. We've picked our way selectively via Hamlet to the psychic and political complexities of Othello. In these plays, psychology doesn't work independently from a whole army of forces that determine the actions of the dramatic characters and the narratives that they embody or advance. Indeed, what we can provisionally call the minds of Shakespeare's dramatic personae are overdetermined by the situations in which they are placed. The invention of backstories might satisfy our own desires for the motivations of their actions, but we need to be very careful about how we construct them. The problem is that up to a point, Shakespeare's language seems very close to our own, and therefore we think that the explanations that we deploy to account for human behavior are those that Shakespeare himself shared. This is further reinforced by the bardolatrous thought that Shakespeare has a worldwide appeal. Now, a little bardolatry doesn't go amiss on Shakespeare's birthday, or at least on the date that we generally assume to be that of Shakespeare's birthday. The point is that Shakespeare's texts give us just enough to enable us to read them intelligibly and to impose our own meanings on them. Psychoanalysis offers us one of a number of keys to understanding these plays, but as a procedure, it contains many strands, some of them very sophisticated indeed. Freud's Oedipus complex is just one way of narrating certain kinds of human behavior, and as I've tried to show, if simply imposed on texts such as Hamlet or Othello or Macbeth, it can raise more problems than it claims to solve. Plucking out the heart of Shakespeare's mystery is a perennial occupation of literary critics and commentators, but elements of that mystery still remain. We go back to these texts because when we do, we never fail to find obstructive details that force us to rethink what we thought were our own settled opinions. Whether this is an index of Shakespeare's greatness does not seem to me to matter. These plays are embedded in ideologies that we may find objectionable, but there's a sense that what we find to criticize, there is a sense that what we find to criticize, the plays themselves have already gestured towards. It's this capacity to see more than one side of a problem that's so fascinating about Shakespeare. He can be sexist, and yet he can mount a critique of sexism, as the case of Emilia makes clear. He can be racist, and yet sustain a critique of racism. He can do the same with anti-Semitism, with monarchy, or indeed with democracy, or indeed, and this is a discourse that has suddenly in the modern world come to the fore, with populism. Thank you.
Very well said, sir. I think this was a spectacle of a lecture. We were able to go through so many different perspectives in the psychological approach with regard to Shakespeare. And I truly agree that whenever we rethink all these different definitions of Shakespeare and his plays, we will always come to a point where he will definitely make us rethink everything that we had concluded about him. So I think now it's time for the Q&A from our YouTube audience, and once more, thank you for staying with us throughout the entire webinar, and we hope to have a great Q&A right now. So we have this one question from Vinay Vasul, and he asks, what do you think about Macbeth's character who tells a man too full with the milk of human kindness? Can you elaborate that in a much more psychoanalytic point of view?
Wow. Well, it's what Lady Macbeth actually says to Macbeth, you know. She says that she doesn't have the milk of human kindness. You know, she's quite prepared, if she was feeding her infant, to rip the infant from her breast and dash its brains out. And she says to Macbeth, but your problem is that you are too full of the milk of human kindness. Now, the milk of human kindness, I think we can gloss in this particular play as Macbeth's moral conscience. And the nature of the tragedy involves that tension between what Macbeth has to do, which is to perform an act of regicide, and then, of course, the moral conscience that prevents him from doing so. That's the tension that we find. And of course, when he crosses that bridge, he crosses the bridge where, you know, he's debating the morality of what he's about to do. Then when he does it, and it turns out to be something other than he'd imagined, right? He doesn't have peace of mind. He doesn't have control of anything. And of course, ironically, neither does Lady Macbeth. Because if you remember, she is the one who's sleepwalking. She is the one who in her sleep is reenacting the consequences of the murder, you know, by rubbing her hands, etc. And there is a sense in which, of course, what Macbeth does in the play is to murder his own humanity, right? He starts with it because, of course, he's loyal to Duncan. I mean, I'm not in the majority when I say that I think the problem in the play is with Duncan, and it's with the violence that Duncan oversees as the monarch. And what Macbeth is doing effectively is sort of replicating that violence. And in a sense, the play really does mount a kind of critique. I mean, it's not pacifist, but at the same time, it does raise the question of what that violence does to humanity, to what, you know, to kind of human values, as it were. Even though those human values are carefully circumscribed in this particular play, we can make sense of it because, of course, we constantly, in our own lives, are torn between doing something that may be illegal, unlawful, or whatever, and what the law and what people around us require us to do. Now, this doesn't mean to say that we're all like Macbeth, because we're not, right? And I think we need to be very careful that we don't suddenly collapse the complexity of this particular play into, the complexity of our own modern lives. But I do think that, that statement, "Thou art too full of the milk of human kindness," is really an indication of the dilemma that the loyal subject faces when he's confronted with a prophecy that he will become king. What do? Do you wait? Do you let everything happen? Or do you kind of usher it along? And there are some funny things that happen when Macbeth contemplates that. I mean, there's one soliloquy in which he talks about the way in which surcease leads to success. Now, those two words that he uses are almost homonymical, but they're not quite. Surcease involves killing and murder. Success involves overcoming this. And they're brought together. And it's a bit like sliding on, well, I mean, I've never slid on blood, so I don't know, but I imagine what sliding on blood must be like. You put your foot down and you slide, or sliding on ice, maybe. Let's not be too dramatic. Well, you put your foot on something that you think is solid, and suddenly it slips. And the language imitates that. The language, in fact, encapsulates that. Okay?
I think it clearly puts things into perspective. Thank you so much for that answer, sir. So now we have Mr. MJ, and Mr. Matthew has this question. Is the gravedigger's scene in Hamlet an early attempt by Shakespeare to bring out the life under the carpet prior to Romantic and succeeding ages?
Oh, wow. Wow. It's a fascinating scene, this. And it's a scene in which the gravedigger gets the better of Hamlet. Right? Now, we need to be very careful here, because there's a sense in which Hamlet is a play, and I mean, one would need a much larger explanation for this. Hamlet is a play in which what we might call the literary, right, language as a literary phenomenon that you can play with, and writing, for example, in a very sort of should we say crude way. Writing separates language from the person. Yes? You read a piece of writing, you infer the person from the writing, but the writing is separate. Okay? And Hamlet is, in a sense, the victim of that, because the literary critic par excellence in this play is Claudius, because it's Claudius who can separate the word from the thought. It's Claudius who can disguise what he's doing, etc. My words fly up, he says, in the prayer, in the closet scene. My thoughts remain below. Okay? And there is that split in Claudius. Now, what the gravedigger does is to give you an oral version of language where he's responding spontaneously to everything that Hamlet asks him. So, when Hamlet says, whose grave is this, sir? He says, well, it isn't mine, but it's my own. And the conversation goes on like this until Hamlet says, whoa, let's stop. We must speak by the card, or else equivocation will undo us. Right? Now, in a way, the language that the gravedigger uses is a language that is now, comparatively speaking, obsolete compared to the sophisticated language of the crowd. We need to be very careful that we don't impose a modern class analysis on this. It would be interesting to compare this with the language of the figure of Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing. Dogberry, you remember, he's the bumbling constable. He's the chief of the watch. And he solves the problem of Don John and all the villains where the sophisticated citizens of Messina can't, right? But he has a very funny way with language, because he takes what should be expressed first, the hierarchy. For example, if you have the word God in a sentence, God must always come first, no matter what it does to the grammar of the language. And there's a tension here between, a hierarchy that he's determined to stick to and a grammar that actually, disrupts that hierarchy. And I think what you're getting with The Gravedigger is something very similar. There are some ideas there that need to be worked out in the form of a comparison between those two. But if you look at all the menial characters in Shakespeare, they all have this capacity to subvert the play's dominant discourses. And this is what The Gravedigger does. And this is why Hamlet gets very irritated with him. Because Hamlet, wants him to speak by the card, he says. The card, of course, is here, it's the shipman's card. In other words, it's the device that allows the shipman, allows the sailor to proceed in a clear direction. Right?
I was just reminded that there was this episode in Expert Library where you managed to make a similar reference to the difference in language that could also contribute the effect of the play. I think you mentioned about how Otholo reacted when he first came to realize about Desdemona's accusation to be true, and you told that how Otholo would actually skip the meter, or you could actually find a difference in language. I was just reminded about that, and I'm just amazed that you could make such a clear and close analysis of the text with regard to the interpretation that we come up with. So we have this another question from K. Kishore Kumar, and he asks, why Shakespeare knowingly killed most of the characters in his dramas mentally and psychologically before physical death?
Sorry, what's the last part of that sentence there? I didn't catch the last part. Why did Shakespeare kill off most of his characters?
Both mentally and psychologically before physical death.
Before physical death. So, the thing is, what the question implies, correct me if I'm wrong, that there are lots of zombies in Shakespeare's plays. Yes. That they're dead people, but they're not yet dead. That doesn't square with my reading, I think, of a Shakespeare play. There are characters who are harbingers of death. And of course, in tragedies, you expect to find death. Although, ironically, in ancient Greek tragedies, not all of them end in death. They usually deal with questions of justice, morality, sort of how society is organized, etc., or the problems in society. I suggested that, in fact, the setting of Venice draws attention to a particular problem that Elizabethans had with. It was called, in fact, it's called an artificial city, Venice, in a poem by James I. This was before he became James I. He wrote a poem about Venice, which he called an artificial city. But no, I'm not sure that really sort of describes accurately how I would see these. But there are occasions in the plays, of course, where characters pretend to be dead. Much Ado About Nothing, which I just referred to, is one in which hero faints and she's assumed to be dead. And then, of course, she's resurrected at the end, and Claudio has to marry her in disguise. And there's an even more surprising one, of course, in The Winter's Tale, where Hermione is not only thought to be dead, but at the end of the play, there's a statue of her. And Leontes, of course, who's caused all of this trouble by jealousy, is told to awake his faith. And if he awakes his faith, then the statue moves. And of course, the statue turns out to be Hermione, and the artist is such that he's able to represent in inverted commas statue the aging process. This is not Hermione as she was. This is Hermione as she is 16 years later. So there is that.
Thank you.
And I was thinking of Romeo and Juliet as well. I was thinking of Romeo and Juliet as well, where the tragedy arises from the fact that Juliet isn't dead in the vault, but she's taken a potion that makes her seem dead. And when Romeo comes in and mistakes it, kills himself, and then she wakes up. There's lots of playing with this kind of thing. But I don't think that's an answer to the question that your questioner asked.
But I think he would have been much convinced with this answer. Since we are at a loss with regard to time, we have so many different questions from our YouTube audience who have been so patiently waiting to communicate with you. But since time is not on our side right now, I would just like to go with this final question from Shreya Singh, and I think it's a worthwhile question. She tells that, what are your thoughts on T.S. Eliot's claim of Macbeth being an artistic success and Hamlet an artistic failure?
Yes, Eliot has some very odd judgments, I think. I think the claim is that Hamlet, Shakespeare can't find what he calls an objective correlative for the experience that he's trying to communicate in Hamlet. I don't agree with that, actually. I think if you look at the play closely enough, there's plenty of evidence there that you can use to explain what's going on. And you don't need Freud, I think, to explain it either, because all of this nonsense about Hamlet's infancy. He has no infancy. It's the one thing we should explain when we deal with psychoanalysis. We have to invent childhoods for these characters. Now, there are certain characters in Shakespeare where their childhoods are mentioned. Richard III is a classic case. And the only other case, of course, is Coriolanus, where we find out a lot about Coriolanus' childhood because, of course, it's replicated in Coriolanus' son, who wanders around taking the wings off butterflies. But other than that, to invent an entire psychodrama for Hamlet and his mother seems to me to be a misreading of the play. And Eliot, of course, was perfectly capable of misreading too. In fact, objective correlative, if I remember rightly, is a 19th century psychoanalytical term.
So, with regard to all these different interpretations, I think we are quite clear that we cannot actually invent or make up stories for the childhood of all these great tragic heroes, and we can definitely agree upon that. I think our YouTube audience would have been much satisfied with this Q&A, and especially with your lecture. And first of all, I on behalf of Litreal, would like to thank you for graciously accepting our invitation to be the lead speaker on this webinar. And this lecture clearly gave us a great insight into psychoanalysis and Shakespearean works, especially Shakespeare himself. And even if we and the children of our grandchildren if they happen to celebrate the 23rd of April on any year in the coming future, they would definitely look back on this occasion as a great tool for aiding their own interpretation of Shakespeare and this tragedy. So we definitely had a wonderful day, and as many of our YouTube audience did comment, I think we along with Professor John Rakakis have spent this most of this day celebrating the birthday of the great William Shakespeare, and for that, Littriel and is pretty much flabbergasted to be a part of this venture. So, as a final note, I would like to ask Professor John Rakakis to give his final words of motivation or final words of triggering the young scholars among our audience. Over to you, sir.
Well, yeah. I think Shakespeare's birthday is a very interesting occasion, and it reminds us of a whole history of things. It's not the first time I've celebrated Shakespeare's birthday. I was once in East Germany, in Weimar, as the guest speaker there, and there's a statue of Shakespeare, and it was at a conference, and during the conference, all the conference delegates march through the town centre, and they then congregate at the statue of Shakespeare. And I was asked to give a valedictory speech. And I can't remember what I said now, but I did borrow £20 from a colleague of mine, the late Clive Barker. And I borrowed it because the £20 note contained a holograph of Shakespeare as the guarantee of the value of this money. He made sure I gave it back to him, by the way. But yes, I think that you come to Shakespeare and you will always find something in these plays, whether you see them performed or whether you read them in the study. Now, the more you read, the more you see performed, the more skeptical you become of some of the readings. And I think this shows no sign of abating at all. As you can see, even from this occasion, you've had 2 lectures with very, very different emphases, and your audience can make up their own minds, and then they can produce further explanations if they wish. That doesn't end. It doesn't end. There's no cutoff point to this at all. So all I can say is that we will continue to celebrate Shakespeare for a variety of different reasons. And, I suppose what we should all do is raise a glass to him on the day that's associated usually with his birthday. So, cheers.
Thank you so much, sir. That was indeed delightful. And over to our audience who have been patiently waiting for us. First and foremost, we at Littriel thank Professor John Rakakis for spending his time for almost 2.5 hours with us live all the way from the United Kingdom. And for that, we will forever be indebted to you, sir. And to our audience who have stuck through us or through the what was the power cut that we experienced, thank you for sticking with us till the end of this webinar. I think there are 400 who are still waiting live with us for the end of the show. But I would just like to clarify certain things. I would just take a few moments or a few minutes of your time. And first of them would be that the certificate or the e-certificate for this webinar will be provided to you by the feedback links that we are going to provide in the description box. You need not worry yourself. You need not lose your sleeps. if you're not able to download the e-certificate right now, because our e-certificate links are able to generate only 100 certificates per day, but not to worry, we have 4 different links. That means 400 certificates per day. We will increase the links also. But please don't worry, all these links will be found in the description box in a matter of 5 minutes. And after that, you can just take your time to download the e-certificate. And please don't forget that we are having a giveaway right now, because if you can happen to view the description box after refreshing this video in a matter of just 5 to 10 minutes, you will just see the download links for 2 ebooks that we are going to give away. And one of them would be Shakespeare Tragedies by A.C. Bradley, and another one would be The Wheels of Fire by Wilson Knight. And I hope you really download it and make use of it, because I think these are seminal texts when it's with regard to Shakespearean criticism. And another important point would be that and I'll make sure that one of the feedback links will be circulated now through the chat box. But these feedback links that I mentioned earlier will be available in the description box of this video for about 2 weeks. So please don't worry. And in the case that you have any queries, please make sure to use our official website, literal.in, and you can just go through the chatbot and we will always be there to help you. And another important thing that I would like to state here would be from the YouTube comments, where many of you were wondering whether this video will be available in YouTube, in Literal's repository. And I assure you that Literal Broadcast is the official YouTube channel of Literal, and we will have all our live events archived in our YouTube channel, and it will always be available for you to view. So, with regard to Professor John Drakakis, I would just like to make one more mention about his experience in Shakespearean tragedy. And we had another interaction with him in the 4th episode of Expert Library, which is a monthly segment that we have in our YouTube channel. And you can just go through our YouTube channel and you can just find it, find the 4th episode. And there you will have so many different interesting remarks by Professor John Drakakis, and that was also in Shakespeare's realm of discussion, which was on Shakespearean tragedies. So, with regard to this particular webinar, this will also be available in our YouTube channel, and you can view it anytime you want. And thank you for patiently sticking with us. And with this final note, please make sure that you make use of the special discount offer that we are having right now with regard to a very important course in English literature on our website, and that would be the history of English literature. So if you happen to go to our official website, you can also find the links in the description box soon in 10 minutes, and you can purchase this course if you need it. And there are also so many prep tests for those special aspirants who are just trying to clear the UGC net every year. If you are a faculty of an institution, or if you are just a college student, please make sure to spread the word that we have so many useful educational content on our website, which with regard to prep tests and quizzes on English literature on various topics. We have more than 10 topics on English literature, and you can just go through it. We also provide so many different courses on English literature. And with that said, please, if you really liked this experience of this webinar, please make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification icon, and don't forget to like this video. Thank you all for sticking with us. Thank you so much. Hope to see you the next time.